Liberation or self-realization can be defined as bringing the imposter self to its final end so that you can remain eternally as your true self, which is absolutely perfect, infinite awareness, love, bliss, that has never experienced any sorrow or suffering in all of eternity. The false self goes by many different names, including A. Ego, B. Mind, C. Thought, D. Thinking, E. The imposter, F. The imposter self. The imposter self is very deceptive. In almost all humans, the imposter self's desire to continue its imaginary existence is much greater than its desire to be brought to a final end. Therefore, the imposter self uses numerous preservation strategies to ensure the continuation of its imaginary existence. The imposter self has trillions of potential preservation strategies. There are as many potential preservation strategies as there are possible combinations of thoughts, beliefs, ideas, concepts, and opinions. The imposter self is thought and controls thinking. One of the imposter self's preservation strategies is to direct people's attention outward, wasting time engaged in unnecessary activities when the time could have been better spent doing the most direct practice that leads to liberation, is a preservation strategy the imposter self uses. Historically, the imposter self has almost always been successful. The imposter self has succeeded in enslaving almost all of the humans of the past. Not even one out of every 100 million humans in the past has attained liberation. This series of 6 books, the Self-Realization series, is for the purpose of conquering all of the obstacles to liberation that the false self creates. The awakening of the extremely intense desire for liberation will put an end to all of the imposter self's preservation strategies. The 2 great keys are: 1. The awakening of the extremely intense desire for liberation. 2. Self-honesty. Self-honesty begins by actually seeing the imposter self's preservation strategies, tricks, and deceptions. The False Self is book 3 in the Self-Realization series. One purpose of this series is to put just one category of quotes into a small book that has the advantage of making it easier to focus, meditate on, grasp, and have insight into just one subject at a time. That makes the approach simple, easier, and less complicated. The idea is to stay focused on just one subject until you have received everything you need to receive from that one subject. Most people go on to the next subject without ever having learned to apply to their lives the subject they are studying now. The Self-Realization series of books are portable practice manuals aimed at helping sincere seekers of self-realization master one key to self-realization at a time. Chapter 1. The Sage's Quotes About the False Self. Sri Ramana Maharishi. 525. So long as one retains a trace of individuality, one is a seeker still, and not a true seer, effort-free, even though one's penance and one's powers may be wonderful indeed. 526. Poor fellow, you who are so proud of your omniscience when you are questioned, you who know all things, do you know who you are? You collapse, disgraced, discomfited. Oh, man of genius, may this your ego mind dry up as dust and perish utterly. 527. Unless by one means or another mind dies out and certitude from true self-recognition comes, the knowledge which mere learning brings is like the horse's horn, unreal. 528. When ego ends, then one becomes a devotee true. When ego ends, one becomes a knower too. When ego ends, one becomes being supreme. When ego ends, grace fills all space. 529. Since every vice springs from the false pleasures of swerving from the self, the plenitude of virtue is the perfect peace of pure awareness, following the end of the ego, which is by such false pleasures fed. 530. When ego goes, there is no loss of being, hence be not afraid. 531. The separate ego wholly dead, the individual self, as pure awareness, brightly shines. This I is not the false conceptual self, earthbound and body-bound. 532. When the ego life dissolves and dies in silence, then one lives the life supreme of pure awareness. When the false ego dreamlike fades into its source, the true self rises of its own accord. 533. Great knowers recognize no other bondage than the rising movements of the mind, and they find true release nowhere but in the total death, leaving no trace behind of every movement of the mind. 534. The false dream ends when we wake up. Even so, the ego dies when the sun, the true I, rises. Ego's destruction by strong self-inquiry is what is known as self-attainment. 535. Only for those free from all sense of doership, the bliss of tranquil peace shines pure within. For the ego proud is the sole evil seed, when spring all known calamities. 536. Whether one is or one is not engaged in work, one gains the state of non-action only when the ego, with its proud delusion, I am the doer, has died and disappeared. 537. The bright awareness, our true being, is the sole truth the heart should cherish. The triads we perceive should be despised and driven away as dreams created by the treacherous mind. 538. Beside the self, nothing in truth exists. But then the deep delusion that the body is oneself makes one let go the solid, non-dual bliss of immortality and fall into birth and death. 539. Of all the demonic qualities, the basis is the ego. 540. Those who have made the hardest sacrifice, that of the ego, have nothing more to renounce. 541. Losing the false ego in awareness and firm abidance as awareness is true clarity. 542. Unlike the ego, which rises and sets, the true self abides forever the same. Turn your back on the false ego, and so destroy it, and then shine as the one self alone. 543. Even as the ego does not die unless the self's glance falls on it, the painful dream of this phenomenal world will never disappear unless the mind meets glorious death. 544. The true light of awareness, pure, subtle, egoless, non-objective, silent, which tires the mind and baffles it till it admits, I know not. This is being awareness. This is the self. 545. Here in this earthly life, there is no greater good than gaining the grandeur of the self supreme. To gain it and enjoy it, search within, and first destroy the ego, false and worthless. Sri Muruganar. 546. The nature of my realization was such that I, that asserts its own reality, was revealed as false and disappeared, but not the I that is the unique, pure, non-dual self that exists permeating all things equally. 547. In the heart, the absolute purity of imperishable grace wells up as consciousness, the supreme, so that the false, deceitful mind that says I is destroyed and disappears. No longer having any duality whatsoever to dwell upon, I exist in the heart with the heart itself as my real nature. 548. In the hearts of true devotees that are infused with the noble light of grace, the dark ignorance of the ghostly ego, unable to operate, will disappear. In the mind in which the delusive and destructive ego has completely died, the glory of grace will spontaneously shine forth in abundance. 549. Other than being consciousness, there is no reliable support whatsoever for the soul. Grace itself is nothing less than the same being consciousness. When the impetus, warring ego, which feeds on the mind's deceit, finally subsides in the heart, it is that same being consciousness that manifests as the life of flooding grace. 550. Until we eliminate the ghost-like ego, the infatuation that arises through the lack of self-attention, the unified consciousness of the real will not arise. Similarly, until that unified consciousness of the real arises, the true love that is free of duality will not rise up in the heart. 551. As long as we do not free ourselves from the state of inattention in which the unified state of the self that exists as pure consciousness is subverted through the ego, the state of love that is the fullness of the real, free of all differentiation, will not be experienced in the heart. 552. The enlightened state in which the grace and wisdom of the self is directly experienced will not come into being unless we separate ourselves from the illusory world of the divided mind so that it can no longer exist. Therefore, we must thoroughly investigate and comprehend our own self so that the hostility of the ghost-like ego that brings with it the torment of an understanding based on differentiation may cease. 553. Through tenacious inquiry into the self, the pure I springs forth, eliminating the false personal identity. We should realize that true I, filled with the light of our own true nature, is the supreme reality itself. 554. Dualistic concepts such as I and he are a treacherous trick of the mind that assumes the form of the body. Eliminate, therefore, this powerful mental imagination and discern the self. 555. Even now, if you entirely eradicate the personal ego based on the multifarious nature of the non-self, you will experience an intense and limitless awakening as your true nature, the Supreme Self, shines out. 556. Realization in all its clarity flourished in the form of self-consciousness, the light of truth shining in the heart as the vast expanse, in which there is no arising of the contemptible ego. 557. The death of the ego, which arises as I, in conjunction with the body's physical form, is synonymous with a new existence in the luminous firmament of the Supreme, free of the embodied mind's forgetfulness of the self. 558. The ego self is like a poison which has its origin in and thrives upon a fundamental misapprehension. Here in the world, it is an enemy masquerading as a friend, and you should root up and cast out every last vestige of it. 559. Allow reality to shine as it truly is, without any obstacle whatsoever, by means of the destruction of the age-old deceit of the hostile ego. 560. Sri Annamalai Swami. The substratum upon which the false idea of the mind has been superimposed is the self. When you see the mind, the self, the underlying substratum is not seen. It is hidden by a false persistent idea, and conversely, when the self is seen, there is no mind. 561. Realizing the self is the only useful and worthy activity in this life, so keep the body in good repair till that goal is achieved. Afterwards, the self will take care of everything, and you won't have to worry about anything anymore. In fact, you won't be able to, because the mind that previously did the worrying, the choosing, and the discriminating will no longer be there. In that state, you won't need it, and you won't miss it. 562. Questioner. So you are saying that believing that I am a body and a particular person is purely imagination, or better still, a bad habit that I should try to get rid of? Annamalai Swami. Correct. This habit has become very strong because you have reinforced and strengthened it over many lifetimes. This will go if you meditate on your real self. The habit will melt away like ice becoming water. 563. The mind only gets dissolved in the self by constant practice. At that moment, the I am the body idea disappears, just as darkness disappears when the sun arises. 564. The body is not the self, the mind is not the self, the real I is the self, and nothing ever happens to or affects the self. Sri Sadhu Om. 565. The happiness obtained through the second kind of absorption, the destruction of the mind, is eternal. It is the supreme bliss. 566. Temporary quiescence of the mind is temporary quiescence of misery, and permanent destruction of the mind is permanent destruction of misery. That is, the mind itself is misery. Hence, let us find out what it is to be done to destroy the mind. 567. When self, our nature of existence consciousness, instead of shining only as the pure consciousness I am, shines mixed with an adjunct as I am a man, I am Rama, I am so-and-so, I am this or that, then this mixed consciousness is the ego. This mixed consciousness can rise only by catching hold of a name and form. When we feel I am a man, I am Rama, I am sitting, I am lying, is it not clear that we have mistaken the body for I, and that we have assumed its name and postures as I am this and I am thus? Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj. 568. As to my mind, there is no such thing. 569. When you believe yourself to be a person, you see persons everywhere. In reality, there are no persons, only threads of memories and habits. At the moment of realization, the person ceases. Identity remains, but identity is not a person. It is inherent in the reality itself. 570. Of what use is the relative view to you? You are able to look from the absolute point of view. Why go back to the relative? Are you afraid of the absolute? 571. Questioner. I am engaged in the study of philosophy, sociology, and education. I think more mental development is needed before I can dream of self-realization. Am I on the right track? Maharaj. To earn a livelihood, some specialized knowledge is needed. General knowledge develops the mind, no doubt. But if you are going to spend your life in amazing knowledge, you build a wall around yourself. To go beyond the mind, a well-furnished mind is not needed. Questioner. Then what is needed? Maharaj. Distrust your mind and go beyond. Questioner. What shall I find beyond the mind? Maharaj. The direct experience of being, knowing, and loving. 572. I take my stand where no difference exists. Where things are not, nor the minds that create them, there I am at home. 573. As long as you do not see that it is mere habit, built on memory, prompted by desire, you will think yourself to be a person, living, feeling, thinking, active, passive, pleased, or pained. Question yourself, ask yourself, is it so? Who am I? What is behind and beyond all this? As soon you will see your mistake. 574. There are so many who take the dawn for the noon, a momentary experience for full realization, and destroy even the little they gain by excess of pride. 575. The sun of truth remains hidden behind the cloud of self-identification with the body. 576. The realized man is egoless. He has lost the capacity of identifying himself with anything. He is without location, placeless, beyond space and time, beyond the world, beyond words and thoughts is he. 577. The false self must be abandoned before the real self can be found. 578. Resolutely remind yourself that you are not the mind and that its problems are not yours. 579. That immovable state which is not affected by the birth and death of a body or a mind, that state you must perceive. 580. Have your being outside of this body of birth and death, and all your problems will be solved. They exist because you believe yourself born to die. Undeceive yourself and be free. You are not a person. 581. You have to be very alert, or else your mind will play false with you. It is like watching a thief. Not that you expect anything from a thief, but you do not want to be robbed. 582. Your personality dissolves and only the witness remains. 583. Any name or shape you give yourself obscures your real nature. 584. All your problems arise because you have defined and therefore limited yourself. When you do not think yourself to be this or that, all conflict ceases. 585. There is no such thing as a person. 586. Don't ask the mind to confirm what is beyond the mind. Direct experience is the only valid confirmation. 587. Without self-realization, no virtue is genuine. 588. By looking tirelessly, I became quite empty, and with that emptiness, all came back to me except the mind. 589. Beyond the mind, all distinctions cease. 590. Questioner. How does one shape one's character? Maharaj, by seeing it as it is, and by being sincerely sorry. The integral seeing feeling can work miracles. 591. The higher can be had only through freedom from the lower. 592. Insanity is universal, sanity is rare. Yet there is hope, because the moment we perceive our insanity, we are on the way to sanity. 593. Questioner. Yet we are afraid of the better and cling to the worse. Maharaj, this is our stupidity, verging on insanity. 594. The false self wants to continue pleasantly. 595. The only radical solution is to dissolve the separate sense of I am such and such person once and for good. 596. The mind is a cheat. 597. I know myself as I am in reality. I am neither the body nor the mind nor the mental faculties. I am beyond all these. 598. It is the I am the body idea that is so calamitous. It blinds you completely to your real nature. Even for a moment, do not think that you are the body. 599. Maharaj, when the mind is kept away from its preoccupations, it becomes quiet. If you do not disturb this quiet and stay in it, you find that it is permeated with a light and a love you have never known, and yet you recognize it at once as your own nature. Once you have passed through this experience, you will never be the same man again. The unruly mind may break its peace and obliterate your vision, but it is bound to return, provided the effort is sustained, until the day when all bonds are broken, delusions and attachments end, and life becomes supremely concentrated in the present. Questioner: what difference does it make? Maharaj: the mind is no more. There is only love in action. 600. Trace every action to its selfish motive, and look at the motive intently till it dissolves. 601. Even the idea of being man or woman, or even human, should be discarded. 602. The person you became at birth and will cease to be at death is temporary and false. You are not the sensual, emotional, and intellectual person gripped by desires and fears. Find out your real being. 603. It is the mind that tells you that the mind is there. Don't be deceived. All the endless arguments about the mind are produced by the mind itself, for its own protection, continuation, and expansion. It is the blank refusal to consider the convolutions and convulsions of the mind that can take you beyond it. 604. Keep on remembering, I am neither mind nor its ideas. Do it patiently and with conviction, and you will surely come to the direct vision of yourself as the source of being, knowing, loving, eternal, all-embracing, all-pervading. You are the infinite focused in a body. Now you see the body only. Try earnestly, and you will come to see the infinite only. 605. You have never been nor shall ever be a person. Refuse to consider yourself as one. 606. The person is merely the result of a misunderstanding. In reality, there is no such thing. Feelings, thoughts, and actions race before the watcher in endless succession, leaving traces in the brain and creating an illusion of continuity. A reflection of the watcher in the mind creates the sense of I, and the person acquires an apparent independent existence. In reality, there is no person, only the watcher, identifying himself with the I and the mind. 607. The sense of identity will remain, but no longer identification with a particular body. Being, awareness, love, will shine in full splendor. Liberation is never of the person, it is always from the person. 608. The person is but a shell imprisoning you. Break the shell. 609. The reward of self-knowledge is freedom from the personal self. 610. The death of the mind is the birth of wisdom. 611. I am not the mind, never was nor shall be. 612. When you know that you are neither body nor mind, you will not be swayed by them. 613. The dissolution of personality is followed always by a sense of great relief, as if a heavy burden has fallen off. 614. It is not you who desires, fears, and suffers. It is the person built on the foundation of your body by circumstances and influences. You are not that person. 615. To know that you are a prisoner of your mind, that you live in an imaginary world of your own creation, is the dawn of wisdom. To want nothing of it, to be ready to abandon it entirely, is earnestness. 616. You must be free from the person you take yourself to be, for it is the idea that you have of yourself that keeps you in bondage. 617. Get busy with your ego. Leave me alone. As long as you are locked up within your mind, my state is beyond your grasp. 618. At present you are moved by the pleasure-pain principle, which is the ego. 619. The ego, like a crooked mirror, narrows down and distorts. It is the worst of all the tyrants. It dominates you absolutely. 620. Freedom from the ego self is the fruit of self-inquiry. 621. To be a person is to be asleep. 622. What prevents you from knowing yourself as all and beyond all is the mind based on memory. It has power over you as long as you trust it. Don't struggle with it, just disregard it. Deprived of attention, it will slow down and reveal the mechanism of its working. Once you know its nature and purpose, you will not allow it to create imaginary problems. 623. Only when you know yourself as entirely alien to and different from the body will you find respite in the mixture of fear and craving inseparable from I am the body idea. 624. When the mind is quiet, it reflects reality. When it is motionless through and through, it dissolves and only reality remains. This reality is so concrete, so actual, so much more tangible than the mind and matter, that compared to it, even diamond is soft like butter. This overwhelming actuality makes the world dreamlike, misty, irrelevant. 625. With the dissolution of the personal I, personal suffering disappears. 626. It is only your mind that prevents self-knowledge. 627. Rebel against your slavery to your mind. See your bonds as self-created and break the chains of attachment and revulsion. 628. To be what you are, you must go beyond the mind into your own being. It is immaterial what is the mind that you leave behind, provided you leave it behind for good. This again is not possible without self-realization. Sri Vasistha. 629. Spreading the net of worldly objects of pleasure, it is this egotism that traps the living beings. Indeed, all the terrible calamities in this world are born of egotism. Egotism eclipses self-control, destroys virtue, and dissipates equanimity. 630. It is this mind alone which is the cause of all objects of the world. The three worlds exist because of the mind stuff. When the mind vanishes, the worlds vanish too. 631. One's own mind has become one's worst enemy. Egotism is the foremost cause for evil. 632. This diversity arises on account of mental modifications, and it will cease when they cease. 633. As long as one clings to the notion of the reality of you and I, there is no liberation. Not by merely verbally denying such a notion of existence is it obliterated. 634. Thought is mind. There is no distinction between the two. 635. When the mind disintegrates, there is liberation, and there is no more rebirth. For it was mind alone that appeared to take birth and to die. 636. Only a fool, not a wise man, is deluded by his own ideas. It is a fool who thinks that the imperishable is perishable and gets deluded. Egotism is but an idea based on a false association with the self, with the physical elements. 637. Egotism promotes cravings. Without it, they perish. 638. Abandon your reliance on fate or gods created by dull-witted people, and by self-effort and self-knowledge make the mind no mind. 639. When the mind is absorbed in the infinite consciousness, there is supreme peace. But when the mind is involved in thoughts, there is great sorrow. The restlessness of the mind itself is known as ignorance or nescience. It is the seat of tendencies, predispositions, or conditioning. Destroy this through inquiry, as also by the firm abandonment of contemplation of objects, of sense pleasure. 640. I, mind, etc. have no existence at all. The one self alone is the truth at all times. 641. Do not get tangled with the moods of your mind, but be established in truth. Regard the mind as a foreigner or a piece of wood or stone. There is no mind in infinite consciousness. That which is done by this non-existent mind is also unreal. Be established in this realization. 642. That the mind is impure is the experience of everyone who strives for liberation. 643. Be established in truth and live in freedom in a mindless state. 644. The notions of I and mine are the ego receptacles which receive sorrow and suffering. He who identifies the body with the self sinks in misery. 645. Worldliness sprouts from the seed of the ego sense. 646. Abandon this ego sense with all the strength that lies within. 647. The one infinite consciousness, which is of the nature of pure bliss, is eclipsed by the shadow of the ego sense. 648. All these notions of I and you are unreal. 649. The practice of restraint bestows great joy and auspiciousness upon you. Hence, resort to self-restraint. Give up ego sense. 650. Only the supreme truth exists, and the individual personality is absorbed in it. 651. This notion of the I cannot be got rid of except through self-knowledge. 652. Pursuing the inquiry into the real nature, the mind abandons its identification even with the body. 653. When the mind gets involved in the external objective universe, it moves away from the self. 654. The mind is naught but ideas and notions. 655. Reality is veiled by the mind and revealed when the mind ceases. 656. In this world, the cause of all misfortunes is only the mind, which is full of sorrow and grief, desire and delusion. Forgetful of self-knowledge, it generates desire and anger, evil thoughts and cravings which throw the person into the fire of sense objects. 657. When even the notion of the ego sense has ceased, you will be like the infinite space. 658. When the limited and conditioned feeling, I am so-and-so, ceases, there arises consciousness of the all-pervading infinite. Hence you too abandon the false and fanciful notion of the ego sense within your own heart. When this ego sense is dispelled, the supreme light of self-knowledge will surely shine in your heart. The ego sense alone is the densest form of darkness. When it is dispelled, the inner light shines by itself. 659. In truth, there is no mind. 660. When the inner light begins to shine, the mind ceases to be. Even when there is light, darkness vanishes. 661. Be firmly established in egolessness and remain unpolluted like space. 662. The mind is the hub around which this vicious cycle revolves, creating delusion in the minds of the deluded. It is by firmly restraining that hub through intense self-effort and keen intelligence that the whole wheel is brought to a standstill. When the hub's motion is stopped, the wheel does not revolve. When the mind is still, illusion ceases. One who does not know this trick and does not practice it undergoes endless sorrow. 663. You will also enjoy freedom when the mind ceases to be, along with the world illusion contained in it. 664. Consciousness, free from the limitations of the mind, is known as the inner intelligence. It is the essential nature of no mind, and therefore it is not tainted by the impurities and concepts and percepts. That is the reality. That is supreme auspiciousness. That is the state known as the Supreme Self. That is omniscience. And that vision is not had when the wicked mind functions. 665. Be without the mind and realize that you are pure consciousness. 666. Mind is like a tree which is firmly rooted in the vicious field known as body. Worries and anxieties are its blossoms. It is laden with the fruits of old age and disease. It is adorned with the flowers of desires and sense enjoyments. Hopes and longings are its branches, and perversities are its leaves. 667. Mind is like a crow which dwells in the nest of this body. It revels in filth. It waxes strong by consuming flesh. It pierces the hearts of others. It knows only its own point of view, which it considers as the truth. It is dark on account of its ever-growing stupidity. It is full of evil tendencies, and it indulges in violent expressions. It is a burden on earth. Drive it far, far away from yourself. 668. Mind is like a monkey. It roams from one place to another, seeking fruits, rewards, pleasures, etc. Bound to this world cycle, it dances and entertains people. Restrain it from all sides if you wish to attain perfection. 669. Tranquilize the mind with the help of the mind itself. Forever abandon every form of mental agitation. Remain at peace within yourself, like a tree freed from the disturbance caused by monkeys. 670. I am that which is indivisible, which has no name nor change, which is beyond all concepts of unity and diversity, which is beyond measure and other than which naught else is. Hence, O mind, I abandon you, who are the source of sorrow. 671. Alas, for so long I have been victimized by ignorance, but luckily I have discovered that which robbed me of self-knowledge. I shall never more be the victim of ignorance. 672. In the absence of self-knowledge, there arose ego sense, but now I am free of ego sense. 673. After having abandoned the very root of ego sense, I rest in the self, which is of the nature of peace. The ego sense is the source of endless sorrow, suffering, and evil action. 675. If the ego sense ceases to be, then the illusory world appearance does not germinate again, and all cravings come to an end. 676. It is only a fool that entertains a feeling, this I am, in relation to that temporary appearance known as the body, etc. 677. It is my fault that I still cling to the notion that you, my mind, is a real entity. When I realize that all these phenomena are illusory appearances, then you will become no mind, and all the memories of sense experiences, etc., will come to an end. It is by the destruction of the mind that there can be happiness. 679. Mind is like a forest, with thought forms for its trees and cravings for its creepers. By destroying these, I attain bliss. 680. Where there is self-knowledge, there is neither mind nor the senses, nor the tendencies and habits, the concepts and percepts. I have attained that supreme state. I have emerged victorious. I have attained liberation. 681. Since all delusion has come to an end, since the mind has ceased to be, and all evil thoughts have vanished, I rest peacefully in my own self. 682. When the mind has ceased to be because of the total absence of the notions of material existence, consciousness exists in its own nature as consciousness, and that is known as pure being. When consciousness devoid of notions of objectivity merges in itself, losing its separate identity as if it were, it is pure being. When all objects, external, material, and internal, notional, merge in consciousness, there is pure being of consciousness. This is the supreme vision which happens to all liberated ones, whether they seem to have a body or they are without one. This vision is available to one who has been awakened, to one who is in a state of deep contemplation, and to a man of self-knowledge. It is not experienced by the ignorant person. 683. There is no such thing as I, nor the world. There is no mind, nor an object of knowledge, nor the world illusion. 684. I am not the enjoyments, nor do they belong to me. This intellect and the sense organs are not me, nor are they mine. They are inert, and I am sentient. I am not the mind, which is the root cause of this ignorant cycle of birth and death. 685. The nature of enlightenment is known only by direct experience. 686. So long as one does not subdue the mind with the mind, one cannot attain self-knowledge. And as long as one entertains the false notions of I and mine, so long sorrow does not come to an end. 687. In the twinkling of an eye, this little ripple known as the mind assumes terrible proportions. Man foolishly ascribes to the self the sorrow and the sufferings that do not touch it in the least, and becomes miserable. 688. All these that constitute the world illusion come into being like a mirage in the desert. This illusion spreads out like waves in the ocean, assuming various names like mind, the faculty of discrimination, the ego sense, the latent tendencies, and the senses. The mind and the ego sense are not in fact two, but one and the same. The distinction is verbal. The mind is the ego sense, and what is known as the ego sense is the mind. 689. Bring about the cessation of the mind. 690. Mind and movement of thought are inseparable, and the cessation of one is the cessation of both. 691. Mind should be destroyed. 692. You do not exist, O mind. 693. For a very long time, this ghost of a mind generated countless evil notions like lust, anger, etc. Now that ghost has been laid, I laugh at my own past foolishness. The mind is dead. All my worries and anxieties are dead. The demon known as ego sense is dead. 694. When the mind ceases to be, the craving ceases to be too. When the mind is dead and the craving is dead, delusion has vanished and egolessness is born. Hence, I am awakened in this state of wakefulness. 695. Thoughts are utterly useless now that the mind is dead. 696. O mind, when you cease to be, all the good and noble qualities blossom. There is peace and purity of heart. People do not fall into doubt and error. There is friendship which promotes the happiness of all. Worries and anxieties dry up. When the darkness of ignorance is dispelled, the inner light shines brightly. Mental distraction and distress cease. Just as when the wind ceases to agitate its surface, the ocean becomes calm. There arises self-knowledge within the realization of truth, puts an end to the perception of the world illusion. The infinite consciousness alone shines. There is an experience of bliss. 697. The existence of the mind causes misery, and its cessation brings joy. 698. As long there is mind, there is no cessation of sorrow. When the mind ceases, the world appearance also ceases to be. The mind is the seed for misery. 699. The very nature of the mind is stupidity. 700. It is not possible to kill the mind without proper methods. 701. Be free of the ego sense and rejoice in the self. 702. As long as the concepts born of ignorance persist, as long as there is perception of that which is not the infinite, and as long as there is hope in the trap known as the world, so long one entertains notions of mind, etc. As long as one considers the body as the I, and as long as the self is related to what is seen, as long as there is hope in objects with the feeling this is mine, so long there will be delusion concerning mind, etc. 703. When incorrect perception has come to an end, and when the sun of self-knowledge arises in the heart, know that the mind is reduced to naught. It is not seen again. 704. The mental conditioning has vanished. The mind has come to an end. 705. The self is not affected by the body, nor is the body in any way related to the self. 706. The individual is nothing more than the personalized mind. Individuality ceases when the mind ceases. 707. This ignorance has become dense by having been expressed and experienced in the thousands of incarnations within and outside this body by the senses. But self-knowledge is not within the reach of the senses. It arises when the senses and the mind, which is the sixth sense, cease. 708. Give up this subservience to the ghost known as ego sense and rest in the self. 709. You are the self, not the mind. 710. The goblin mind residing in the body has nothing to do with the self, yet it quietly assumes, I am the self. This is the cause of birth and death. This assumption robs you of your courage. 711. If it is realized that the perceived mind itself is unreal, then it is clear that the perceived world is unreal too. 712. The mind of the knower of the truth is no mind. 713. He who is polluted by the ego sense, whether he is a learned scholar or one superior even to that, he is indeed a wicked man. 714. This creation is no doubt born of ignorance, and the belief in creation destroys our true perception. Though this creation is unreal, yet on account of the emergence of the ego sense, it appears to be solidly real. 715. The cause of this world appearance and bondage is indeed the mind. 716. The best method is by inquiring into the nature of the self, which is infinite. Your mind will be completely absorbed, then both the mind and the inquiry will cease. Remain firmly established in what remains after that. 717. This supreme consciousness alone exists. It is the supreme truth, untainted by any impurity, forever in a state of perfect equilibrium, and devoid of ego sense. Once this truth is realized, it shines constantly without setting. 718. I am pure consciousness, devoid of ego sense, and all-pervading. There is neither birth nor death for this consciousness. 719. One thing still remains to be renounced, your ego sense. If the heart abandons the mind, there is realization of the absolute. 720. Worries or movements of thoughts alone are known as mind. Thought, notion, concept is another name for the same thing. 721. The utter destruction or extinction of the mind is the extinction of the creation cycle. It is also known as the abandonment of the mind. Therefore, uproot this tree, whose seed is the I idea, with all its branches, fruits, and leaves, and rest in the space in the heart. 722. Realize I am not that ego sense, and rest in pure awareness. 723. All notions cease. The falsity which arose as the mind ceases when notions cease. 724. Ignorance lasts only so long as the mind functions. 725. There is no mind in the liberated ones. 726. Renunciation of the mind is total renunciation. 727. The ego sense is unreal. Do not trust it. 728. The ego sense look upon the space around it as itself and its possession. Thus it identifies itself with the body, etc., which it desires to protect. The body, etc., exists and perished after some time. On account of this delusion, the ego sense grieves repeatedly, thinking that the self is dead and lost. When the pod, etc., are lost, the space remains unaffected. Even so, when the bodies are lost, the self remains unaffected. The self is pure consciousness, subtler than even space. It is never destroyed. It is unborn. It does not perish. 729. Remain in pure egoless state. 730. The notion, I am the body, is bondage. The seeker should avoid it. I am no thing but pure consciousness. Such understanding, when it is sustained, is conducive to liberation. It is only when one does not realize the self, which is free from old age, death, etc., that one wails aloud, "Alas, I am dead," or "I am helpless." It is by such thoughts that ignorance is fortified. Free your mind from such impure thoughts and notions. Rest in the self, free from such notions. 731. When the ego sense dies, ignorance perishes, and that is known as liberation. 732. All these notions exist in the mind. Subdue the mind by the mind. Purify the mind by the mind. Destroy the mind by the mind. 733. When the movement of the mind has ceased, the self shines by its own light. In that light all sorrow comes to an end. And there is the bliss which the self experiences in itself. 734. I am that which is beyond the body, mind, and senses. 735. The abandonment of notions is a supreme good. 736. The non-perception of objects and the non-arising of notions, this should be experienced. 737. When the mind abandons its conditioning, the objects lose their temptation. 738. One who has not abandoned the ego sense and mindness knows neither renunciation, nor wisdom, nor peace. 739. The Supreme Self is in the Supreme Self, the infinite in the infinite, the peace in peace. That is all there is, neither I, nor the world, nor the mind. 740. When the seed for the world appearance, which is the ego sense, has been destroyed, the world appearance goes with it. Even as the mirror gets misted by moisture, the self is veiled by the unreal ego sense. This ego sense gives rise to the rest of this world appearance. When it goes, then the self shines by its own light, even as the sun shines when the veiling cloud is blown away. 741. Just as an object thrown into the ocean dissolves in the ocean, the ego sense which enters the self is dissolved in it. 742. Self-knowledge is the realization of the unreality of the ego sense. Nothing else can ensure your true welfare. Hence, first abandon the individualized ego sense. 743. Know that all you experience in the name of mind, ego sense, intellect, etc., is nothing but ignorance. This ignorance vanishes through self-effort. 744. Wherever the ego sense arises, there the world manifests itself. The ego sense is the first cause of this world's illusion. 745. If one is able to remove the ego sense by means of one's awakened intelligence, he cleanses from his consciousness the impurity known as world appearance. 746. The men of wisdom perceive that the entire creation is hidden in the ego sense. 747. If the I-ness or ego sense ceases in you, you will remain like the space, and there will be peace. 748. The ego sense that perceives the diversity is the creator of the division. The ego sense is bondage, and its cessation is liberation. It is so simple. 749. I am the body is delusion, not truth. You are the pure self or undivided consciousness. 750. The notion of I is utter ignorance. It blocks the path to liberation. 751. When a dream object perishes, nothing is lost. When the world or the I is lost, nothing is lost. 752. The abandonment of ego sense is the cessation of ignorance. This and nothing else is liberation. 753. The ego sense is unreal, though it appears to be real. 754. On examination, even the body, etc., are seen to be unreal and false, when even the mind has ceased with the cessation of notions concerning the body and the world. The self or the infinite consciousness alone remains. 755. Matter and mind are identical, and both are false. You are deluded by this false appearance. Self-knowledge will dispel this delusion. Both self-knowledge and the cessation of world appearance are the characteristics of wisdom. 756. In the infinite and unmodified or unconditioned consciousness, modification is impossible. The conditioning is but a false notion. Therefore, it melts away in the heart of one who has self-knowledge and who is free from delusion and ego sense. 757. To the wise there is neither ego sense nor the world. 758. The self alone is real, devoid of its concepts of time, space, and such other notions. The self is not a void. This truth is realized only by those who are established in the supreme state, not by those who rest in ego sense. 759. Human beings are narrow-minded and petty-minded, interested in the trivia of life. They spend most of their time in pursuit of evil desires. 760. They are tempted away from the path of order and wisdom by their own vanities and desires. 761. Among human beings there are liberated ones, but they are extremely rare. 762. Though the body is experienced to be real, it does not exist in truth. 763. You are not this little personality. 764. Limitless is this ignorance with countless branches in all directions. It cannot come to an end by any means other than self-knowledge. 765. I am not a wave. I am the ocean. When thus the truth is realized, the waveness ceases. 766. The mind itself appears to be the objects of perception, just as in dream. 767. The physical or material universe does not exist at any time, anywhere. The subtle body itself appears to be the solid body on account of the notion of such solidity arising in it repeatedly. Its very source is unreal. 768. For one who rests in his own self and rejoices in the self, in whom cravings have ceased and ego sense is absent, life becomes non-volitional and there is perfect purity. One in millions, however, is able to reach this unconditioned state of pure being. Sri Sankara. 769. This body is the product of food. It constitutes the material sheath. It depends on food and dies without it. It is a mass of skin, flesh, blood, bones, and uncleanness. It is not fit to see as oneself, who is ever pure. 770. One's true self shines forth again when the contamination is removed. 771. Eliminate completely your self-identification with this body, and with determination see that your mind is devoted to the removal of all ideas and additions to your true self. 772. So long as even a dreamlike awareness of yourself as an individual in the world remains, as a wise person persistently see to the removal of all ideas of additions to your true self. 773. The tendency to see me and mine in the body and the senses, which are not oneself, must be done away with by the wise by remaining identified with one's true self. 774. The wise who have experienced reality call the mind ignorance. 775. The sage who stands in the eternal, the self of being ever full of the secondless bliss of the self, has none of the hopes fitted to time and space that make for the formation of a body of skin and flesh subject to dissolution. 776. Drawing near to the eternal stainless awakening, whose nature is bliss, put very far away this disguise whose nature is inert and foul. 777. Outward attachment arises through sensual objects, inward attachment through personality. Only he who, resting in the eternal, is free from passion, is able to give them up. 778. There is no other danger for him who knows but this wavering as to the self's real nature. Thence arises delusion, and thence selfish personality. Thence comes bondage, and therefrom sorrow. 779. Bringing to an end the activity of the selfish personality, all passion being laid aside, when the supreme object is gained, rest silent, enjoying the bliss of the self, in the eternal, through the perfect self, from all doubt free. 780. When the false self ceases utterly, and the motions of the mind caused by it come to an end, then by discerning the hidden self, the real truth that I am that is found. 781. When free from the grasp of selfish personality, he reaches his real nature. Bliss and being shine forth by their own light. 782. Man's circle of birth and death comes through the fault of attributing reality to the unreal. But this false attribution is built up by mind. This is the effective cause of birth and death and sorrow. 783. Man's circle of birth and death is built by mind and has no permanent reality. 784. There is no unwisdom except in the mind, for the mind is unwisdom, the cause of the bondage to life. When this is destroyed, all is destroyed. When this dominates, the world dominates. 785. Thinking things not self are I. This is bondage for a man. This, arising from unwisdom, is the cause of falling into the weariness of birth and dying. Chapter 2. The Imposter. Number 1. These are the definition of the words ego, self, and thought that will be used in this book. Number 2. Thought. Thoughts are the words of your language in your mind. 3. If your native language is English, and you write in English and speak English, those same English words in your mind are thoughts. 4. If you are fluent in 2 languages, then the words of those 2 languages in your mind is thought. 5. Ego. Ego is the thought I. 6. The ego is the I thought. 7. I am happy. I am sad. I did this. I did that. There are so many sentences in thought that contain the word I. That thought I in each of those sentences is the ego. 8. The ego is the idea of a separate individual identity. 9. The ego identifies with the body and with thought and calls the body and thought I. 10. The ego is thought. 11. The ego is thinking. 12. Self. The self is infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. Those are 5 words pointing towards one awareness. Awareness, love, bliss are not 3. They are 1. 13. The self is the background of awareness. 14. Because almost all humans are in the habit of looking outward towards thoughts, the body, the world, people, places, things, etc., it appears as though the background of awareness, the self, wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night. 15. If you turn your attention towards the background of awareness, eventually you will discover the background of awareness is continuous. 16. Because almost all humans are in the habit of looking outward towards thoughts, the body, the world, people, places, things, etc., it appears as though the background of awareness is limited. 17. If you turn your attention towards the awareness that wakes up in the morning, instead of towards people, places, things, thoughts, etc., eventually you will discover that awareness is infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. 18. The background of awareness that wakes up in the morning is there during the waking hours until one goes to sleep at night. 19. Thoughts come and go, but the background of awareness that is aware of the thoughts is there during all the waking hours and does not come and go. 20. The background of awareness is the true self. 21. Before you learned the language you now think in, the background of awareness was there. 22. Then you learned the word I in your language. 23. Your body was given a name, and when people saw that body, they said, "There goes John," or Mike, or Jane, or Julie, or Kumar, or Radha, or whatever name they gave your body. 24. Thus the idea arose, I am John, I am this body. 25. You existed as the background of awareness before that I thought arose. 26. The thought calling itself I is an imposter self. 27. The background of awareness is the true self. 28. The fact that you existed before you learned the language that became your thoughts helps to reveal the difference between your true self and the imposter. 29. Because you existed as the background of awareness before you learned the language that produced the thoughts you now think in, you can easily see that the thought I is an imposter. 30. All thoughts are opposed to your real nature. 31. You know that thoughts are not part of your true nature because you had to learn them. 32. That is why you cannot speak, write, and think fluently in 200 different languages, because you have not acquired those languages. 33. You can observe that same process in an infant. 34. You can see that an infant is aware before it learns any language. 35. You can observe the child growing older and learning a language. 36. You can observe when the child learns the word I and when the child begins to say the word I. 37. Being able to see how the imposter arose in you and how the imposter arises in every human, infant, and child is a very important tool. 38. The reason it is a very important tool is You do not have to rely upon someone else to tell you that the ego is an acquired imposter. 39. You can observe this for yourself. 40. Thought is something foreign, alien to the true self. 41. Thought pretends to be the self. 42. Thought is not the self. 43. Thought is an imposter. 44. Thought believes thought is a real entity, and thought believes thought is a real self. 45. Thought is not a real entity, and thought is not a self. 46. Living from thought instead of living from awareness is the cause of all human suffering. 47. The imposter, thought ego, is the cause of all human problems, sorrow, and suffering. 48. The background of awareness is the true self. 49. The awareness that appears to wake up in the morning is the true self. 50. The awareness that is looking through your eyes now is the true self. 51. As an example for clarification, you could view thinking a memory as something like a computer program. 52. Within that computer program is a virus. 53. The virus is called the I thought. 54. The virus controls the program. The I thought controls the thinking. 55. The virus pretends to be yourself. The I thought pretends to be yourself. 56. The virus creates tremendous sorrow and suffering. The I thought creates tremendous sorrow and suffering. 57. None of the sorrow or suffering is needed. 58. What is needed is to delete the virus that pretends to be yourself. What is needed is to delete the imposter self. 59. When one attempts to delete the virus creates many thoughts, claiming that deleting the virus is not a good idea. 60. The virus has many strategies to preserve the illusion that it is real, and to continue the delusion that it is the real self. 61. In humans, the program that came from the outside and took control of their awareness is called thought, language, and thinking. 62. In humans, the virus is called the ego or the I thought. 63. The I thought ego is an imposter pretending to be the self. 64. The ego is the cause of all human sorrow and suffering. 65. The ego is the cause of all disease, death, war, fear, anger, and violence. 66. Although many thousands of years have passed, human beings have made almost no inward progress towards ending suffering, sorrow, war, fear, anger, violence, cheating, and lying. 67. Thousands of years ago, humans had suffering, sorrow, war, fear, anger, violence, cheating, and lying. 68. Now, today, currently, humans have suffering, sorrow, war, fear, anger, violence, cheating, and lying. 69. What has kept humans in the same pool of inward unsolved problems? 70. The ego, the imposter, has kept humans in the same pool of inward unsolved problems. 71. Inward problems cannot be solved by looking outward. 72. Inward problems can only be solved by looking inward. 73. The ego knows that if the attention is turned inward, the ego will be found to be a myth, an imposter, an illusion, a delusion, a dream. 74. Therefore, due to the ego's fear of ending, the ego keeps the attention directed outwards. 75. Usually when people attempt to turn the attention inward, they are still looking outwards because they do not understand the meaning of looking inwards. Observing thoughts, feelings, or desires is not looking inwards. Only awareness, observing awareness, is looking inwards. 76. All humans are slaves, and the imposter self is their master. 77. Exposing the preservation strategies of that imposter self, how to put an end to those strategies, how to bring the imposter self to an end, thus ending all suffering and sorrow, and remaining in the true self, whose nature is infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss, are the primary purposes of this self-realization series of books. 78. Ending the ego does not end the body. 79. After the ego ends, the body will live out a natural course of its life. 80. One should never attempt to harm the body. 81. The ego is the I thought. 82. Ending the ego is ending the I thought. 83. Ending the bodily life will not end the ego. 84. The ego will create the dream of a new body when the old body ends. 85. Thus, ending the body does not help to solve the problems. 86. Humans almost always have their attention directed outward towards thoughts, people, places, things, experiences, etc. 87. The background of awareness is the true self, and humans almost always ignore it. 88. Your true self deserves your attention. 89. When humans turn their attention away from thoughts, the body, the world, people, places, things, experiences, etc., and towards their awareness, eventually they will directly experience their true self. 90. The imposter thought, pretending to be yourself, and calling its pretend self I, should not be tolerated even for one moment. 91. Especially an imposter that has created so much suffering and sorrow should not be tolerated even for one moment. For example, all of the trillions of acts of violence throughout human history were created by the imposter self. All human sorrow and suffering is created by the imposter self. 92. The imposter thought is like a parasite. 93. Because the ego believes that it is a real entity, the ego is afraid of ending. 94. The ego controls all thinking. 95. Because the ego is afraid of ending and controls all thinking, the ego directs thought in ways that will preserve its imaginary self, so that its imaginary self is not brought to an end. 96. The purpose of the teaching of the self-realization series of books is to bring the imposter to an end, so that what remains is only the true self, whose nature is absolutely perfect, infinite, eternal, awareness, love, bliss. 97. When the imposter ends, all suffering and sorrow also end. 98. Imagining that thinking or thought is yourself is a delusion, a dreamlike illusion. 99. Thinking that you are a body living in a world is a delusion, a dreamlike illusion. 100. Thought has created those delusions. 101. All sorrow, suffering, and delusions have one single root. 102. The single root is thought. 103. The root of thought is the I thought. 104. The root of thought is the thought I. 105. Thought is not part of your true nature. Thought is something you learned. 106. Do not allow something you acquire to pretend to be yourself. 107. Try this experiment. Set aside 2 hours when you have no other activities going on Sit down in a place where you will not be disturbed. Shut your eyes. Make a decision that for the next 2 hours you will not allow a single thought to arise. If you are really in control of thinking, then not even one thought will arise. If thinking controls you, then even though you have made the decision not to allow a single thought to arise, you will not be able to sit for 2 hours without a single thought arising. What a revelation this can be, to discover that thought, something that you acquired, now controls you. 108. The book you are reading now, The False Self, contains a description of the secret that has enslaved humanity for as long as there have been humans. Chapter 3. The Imposter's Tricks. Number 1. The ego controls all thinking. Number 2. The ego can create an argument against anything. Number 3. Therefore, reserve all arguments against what is being presented here until you have read the book at least 3 times. 4. Otherwise, the ego will generate arguments against any anti-ego presentation, thus blocking what is being presented. 5. See the vicious cycle. 6. The ego, in its attempts to prevent the ego from being exposed for the imposter that it is, and to block the realization that the ego is the cause of all human sorrow and suffering, creates arguments against what is revealed in this book. 7. Because the ego sets the standards for the debate, the ego always wins the debate. 8. The way to break that vicious cycle is to delay all arguments against what is presented here until you have read the book very slowly, at least 3 times. 9. When the ego forms an argument against something in this book, see the argument as an ego preservation strategy and ignore it, postponing all argument until the presentation is completed. 10. Having the motivation to understand instead of the motivation to argue will help to produce an insight into what is being presented here. 11. Put the arguments on hold until you have read the book at least 3 times. 12. By that time you may be skilled at recognizing the ego's preservation strategies. You may decide to delay the arguments forever. 13. At least give what is being presented here a fair chance by being aware of the arguments that the ego creates and disregarding those arguments until an insight into what is revealed here is awakened. 14. Plenty of time to argue later after reading the entire book. 15. The ego has been deceiving humans for as long as there have been humans. 16. Be aware of the ego's attempts to deceive you. 17. The ego controls all thinking, therefore various combinations of thoughts, ideas, beliefs, opinions are the ego's primary tools to preserve the ego's imaginary self and to prevent you from discovering your true self. 18. Most humans have never observed the background of awareness, not even for 1 second. 19. Therefore, whatever opinions most people have about what the background of awareness is, what its qualities are, what the true self is, etc., have no basis. 20. If you observe the background of awareness for many hours every day for a number of years, then you will eventually know that your awareness is infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. 21. Because most humans spend their entire lives looking outward at thoughts, the body, the world, people, places, things, etc., most humans never observe their own awareness, not even for 1 moment in their entire lifetimes. 22. Concepts, beliefs, and conclusions are not truly important. What is truly important is direct experience. 23. Be aware of your thoughts, ideas, beliefs, opinions, and see how they serve the ego. 24. See Chapter 2 for clarification of the difference between the ego and the true self. 25. Read the books in this self-realization series as a guide to direct experience. Never read an authentic direct path teaching as a theory for intellectual entertainment. 26. Because the ego is afraid of ending, the ego directs and creates thoughts, ideas, concepts, beliefs, and opinions that will help the ego to continue its illusion of being real, and that will prevent the ego from being brought to an end. 27. Those thoughts, ideas, concepts, beliefs, and opinions are ego preservation strategies. Ego preservation strategies can also be called the ego's tricks. 28. Because thoughts can be combined in trillions of combinations, the ego can create trillions of preservation strategies. 29. The ego has the ability to hide what it is doing from itself. 30. The ego creates ego preservation strategies throughout the entire day. Most people are not aware of the ego's preservation strategies. 31. If you are not aware of how the ego preserves its imaginary self, then the ego succeeds in preserving its imaginary self. 32. In your day-to-day life, watch carefully to see how the ego preserves its imaginary self. For example, watch how the ego leads you into unnecessary activities instead of spiritual practice. Look at the rationalizations, excuses, and reasons that the ego creates to justify your engaging in unnecessary activities. Stopping all unnecessary activities creates more time for spiritual practice. 33. If 1 million people study a spiritual teaching and only one of those people ends the ego illusion, why did the other 999 miss the opportunity? 34. The reason the other 999,999 people missed the opportunity is because of the ego's fear of ending. 35. Due to the ego's fear of ending, the ego creates strategies to preserve its imaginary self. 36. Distorting spiritual teachings is one of the many strategies the ego uses to preserve its imaginary self. 37. People project their own thoughts, ideas, concepts, opinions, beliefs, and interpretations unto the spiritual teachings they are studying. When those interpretations, etc., are added to the teaching is no longer the teaching. When studying the direct path teachings, be aware of when you are adding your own thoughts and interpretations. Say to yourself, those are my thoughts. Now, without my ideas, opinions, beliefs, conclusions, and interpretations, what does the teaching actually state? 38. Right from the beginning, the ego's preservation strategies have to be dealt with. 39. If the ego's preservation strategies are not dealt with, the ego will block out or distort what is revealed in the spiritual teaching you are studying. Most attempts at awakening fail because of failure to put an end to the ego's preservation strategies. 40. The ego's preservation strategies can be brought to an end. One of the purposes of the self-realization series of books is to teach how to put an end to the ego's preservation strategies. 41. Usually any mention of exposing the ego's preservation strategies makes the ego run the other way. In most people, the ego hides its preservation strategies from its imaginary self. 42. Being willing to look at the ego's preservation strategies is a sign of spiritual maturity. 43. Most people are not willing to look at the ego's preservation strategies. 44. Reading a book that reveals some of the ego's preservation strategies will not make you immune to them. You have to actually put the self-realization teachings into practice to bring the ego's preservation strategies to an end. 45. One of the ego's preservation strategies is the thought, "This does not apply to me." 46. The ego is very tricky and deceptive in all humans. The ego is a liar in all humans. The ego lies to its imaginary self. 47. When something is pointed out in this book and you think, "This does not apply to me," take a second look. 48. Maybe it does apply to you, and the ego is blocking that fact out as a preservation strategy. 49. Challenge the thought, "This does not apply to me." 50. The thought, "This does not apply to me," may be an ego preservation strategy. 51. One of the differences between the 1 out of a million who awakens and the others who do not is the ability to stay focused on an essential point until it becomes an insight and a tool that you can use. 52. An intellectual understanding of what is revealed in the self-realization series of books is only the first step. The second step is to go beyond thought to awaken insight. 53. The self-realization series of books are filled with the insights that lay the foundation for you to be the one who awakens and not one in the millions who miss. 54. Dwell on what is written in every sentence, in every chapter of every book in the self-realization series, until insights are awakened that become tools you can use. To awaken insight, don't read what is written in the self-realization series the way you read a newspaper or trivia, and don't read for the purpose of gathering information. 56. To awaken insight, read as though you are reading instructions about how to fly that are vital to prevent you from crashing. 57. Slowly reflect on each sentence. 58. That is why the sentences are numbered with the space between them, to encourage you to reflect slowly on each sentence, to pause, and not to hurry to the next sentence. 59. Continue to reread long after the intellect has understood the meaning of the words. 60. Reading very, very slowly is insight reading. 61. Reading very slowly, then read at an even slower pace, allowing you to look deeply into each sentence and to see what each sentence points towards. 62. The ego is like an inchworm that lets go of one thought only when it has grabbed hold of the next thought. 63. Therefore, when rereading every sentence many times over and over, don't be in a hurry to proceed to the next sentence. Stay with each sentence for a long time before reading the next sentence. 64. It is important to understand the difference between insight and intellectual understanding. 65. Never confuse intellectual understanding with insight. 66. Intellectual understanding, which means understanding the words, is a good first step. 67. However, after one has understood the words, if one then goes on to another concept before insight has awakened, the words may become obstacles and hindrances instead of tools that end the ego. 68. Intellectual understanding, an intellectual appetite, and an intellectual approach to spirituality are what characterize the 999,999 who miss. 69. Insight is the approach used by the 1 in a million who brings the ego to its final end. 70. Most people study spiritual teachings because they enjoy the concepts. 71. The ego is fundamentally dishonest in humans, and the ego has the ability to hide what it is doing from its imaginary self. 72. Therefore, many people fail to see that their primary reason for studying spiritual teachings is because they enjoy the concepts. 73. The desire to go quickly to the next concept and to gather more and more information and to read thousands of spiritual books and to think about what has been read and to discuss what has been read and thought about are symptoms of the intellectual appetite and intellectual spirituality. 74. Approaching the study of spiritual teachings intellectually, as just described in 73, is an approach used by 999,999 who miss. 75. One of the ego's tricks is to get lost in spiritual concepts, opinions, philosophies, or beliefs. 76. The report of direct experience by those who have brought the imposter self to its final end and practical, clearly and directly communicated instructions teaching how to bring the imposter self to its final end is what is of true value to those extremely rare and extremely few sincere seekers of self-realization. 77. Ideas are not what the self-realization series of books point towards. 78. These books point towards the awareness that is prior to thought and how to directly experience that awareness. 79. The ego likes to scatter attention. 80. Scattering attention is one of the ego's preservation strategies. 81. Thinking scatters attention. 82. To bring the attention to a single point and to dwell on that single point for a very long time is the way to awaken insight. 83. Insight is not thinking, and insight is not belief. 84. Insight is a permanent new perspective. 85. To find one powerful quote, not a quote that the spiritually immature ego selects in its effort to preserve itself, and to stay with that quote until insight awakens, is the kind of approach used by the 1 in a million who brings the ego to its final end. 86. One might stay with a single quote for 1 day or 1 week or much longer than 1 week. Those who use this approach are rare. 87. Keeping the attention directed outward is one of the ego's fundamental tricks. 88. Creating unnecessary activities is one way the ego keeps the attention directed outward and is another one of the ego's tricks. 89. Dropping all unnecessary activities to create the maximum amount of time for spiritual practice is an essential key to success in bringing the ego to its final end. 90. Pretending that a journey through thought is an authentic spiritual journey is also one of the ego's tricks. 91. The ego has many tricks to draw upon, as there are concepts, ideas, beliefs, and opinions. 92. Choosing belief instead of direct experience is one of the ego's tricks. 93. Wasting time is one of the ego's tricks. 94. Spending time in entertainment that could have been spent in spiritual practice is one of the ego's tricks. 95. Almost all thoughts are just the ego's tricks. 96. Reflect on one sentence for a very long time before reading the next sentence. 97. Reflecting means looking. 98. Reflecting does not mean thinking, and reflecting does not mean arguing. 99. Stay with each sentence until you have an insight into it. 100. The previous sentence, 99, describes a key approach used by the 1 in a million who succeeds in living in infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. 101. There are few key principles to be understood, and some reading may have required for that. 102. Be very careful when choosing which spiritual books to read. Almost all of the spiritual teachings from the past were created by the ego for the purpose of preserving the ego's imaginary self. Those spiritual teachings that were not created by the ego were immediately distorted by the ego to serve the ego. The result is the same either way. Almost all of the spiritual teachings from the past serve the ego. 103. Discussing and thinking about spiritual teachings are ego preservation strategies. Tricks created by the ego to preserve its imaginary self. 104. The ego continues thinking about spiritual concepts to avoid the practice that leads to the ego's final end. 105. The ego keeps people lost in an endless maze of concepts. 106. Spiritual concepts do not lead to freedom. 107. Only practice leads to freedom. 108. However, it must be the most rapid and direct spiritual practice, and not a practice created by or distorted by the ego. Chapter 4. The Imposter Tools: Thought, Thinking, and Beliefs. 1. Thought is the primary tool the ego uses to preserve its imaginary self. 2. Therefore, it is important to see how the ego uses thought to create ego preservation strategies. 3. First, one must understand the nature of thinking, thought, concepts, and beliefs, and the myths the ego has created about thinking, thought, concepts, and beliefs. 4. Thought is not a means to discover the absolute truth. 5. The ego has convinced almost all humans and almost all spiritual aspirants that thought is a means to know the absolute truth. 6. Some people think they already know that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. 7. Almost all of those people are still trying to use thought as a means to know the absolute truth. 8. This reveals that they do not really know that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. 9. They have confused knowing, insight, awareness with conceptual knowing. 10. People tend to believe in thought. 11. Thinking is controlled by the ego, and the ego uses thought to preserve its imaginary self. 12. Therefore, to believe in thoughts, ideas, and concepts, including those thoughts that people imagine are their own, is an error that results in failure to end the ego. 13. Thoughts, ideas, beliefs, concepts, emotions, and desires are the fundamental tools the imposter self, the ego, uses to prevent you from directly experiencing your true self. 14. For those few individuals who are seriously intent on liberation, it is essential to stop using thought as a means to know the absolute truth. 15. It is also essential to stop believing in thoughts, ideas, and concepts, including those thoughts, ideas, and concepts you imagine being your own. 16. Understanding the nature of belief can help one to see that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. 17. Seeing that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth is the way to stop using thought as a means to know the absolute truth. 18. There is a method that you can try that reveals that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. 19. It is the how do you know method. 20. Here are the instructions for the how do you know method. 21. Look at any belief you have. 22. Ask of that belief, how do I know absolutely for sure this is true? 23. The mind will give an answer. 24. To the answer the mind gives, ask, How do I know absolutely for sure this is true? 25. Every time the mind gives an answer, question the answer by repeating the question. How do I know absolutely for sure that this is true? 26. You must be willing to question every answer the mind gives you for the method to work. 27. If you are willing to question every answer the mind gives to the question, how do I know absolutely for sure this is true? The inquiry will always end in, I don't know absolutely for sure this is true. 28. The how do you know method is an excellent way to see the difference between believing and knowing. 29. The how do you know method is also an excellent way to see that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. 30. After questioning a few hundred beliefs using the how do you know method, it should be quite clear that thought is not a means to know the absolute truth. Thought is like a great pretense or house of cards. One idea is supported by another idea. 33. How do you know method is a way to see that when you trace each idea back, you find there is actually no real foundation at all. 34. There is another way to see that thought is not a way to know the absolute truth. Understand the nature of belief and concepts. See how belief is formed and how the ego creates ideas that preserve its imaginary self. 35. It is the arguing both sides method. 36. The arguing both sides method begins by looking at some belief you have, maybe one of the current issues of the day. 37. Write an argument for your belief. 38. Look at your belief and write up all the proofs, arguments, evidence, and reasons that support it. 39. Next, pretend that you have the opposite belief and write up all the proofs, arguments, evidence, and reasons that support that opposite belief. 40. The purpose of the arguing both sides method is to demonstrate that thought can create reasons, evidence, and support for any belief. 41. Seeing that thought can create evidence and reasons to support any belief is a very powerful key. 42. The arguing both sides method is another way of revealing that thought is really baseless. 43. The arguing both sides method also demonstrates that thought forms conclusions based on motive. 44. Evidence is not the primary factor that determines what conclusions and beliefs will be formed. 45. Motivation is the primary factor in the forming of beliefs. 46. Evidence will be gathered to support the motive. 47. The ego will gather all the so-called evidence and reasons to support what the ego wants to believe. 48. The ego's primary motive is to preserve its imaginary self. 49. Therefore, the ego directs thought to create concepts that will help to preserve its imaginary self. 50. In almost all humans, including almost all spiritual aspirants and students, the desire of the ego to preserve its imaginary self is very strong. 51. In almost all humans, including almost all spiritual aspirants and students, the ego directs thought to create concepts that will preserve its imaginary self. 52. One of the ego's preservation strategies is selecting spiritual teachings that are not direct. 53. Even if one manages to find the direct path teachings, the ego will distort the direct path teachings by interpreting what is written or said in a way that supports the ego, or the ego will distort the direct path teachings by focusing on that which is not essential. 54. One of the tricks, ego preservation strategies, that the ego uses most commonly with spiritual aspirants is to confuse intellectual spirituality with authentic spirituality. 55. Most people only have an intellectual interest in spiritual concepts and do not wish to end the ego. 56. Most people just enjoy learning about the concepts. 57. There are some people who realize their interest is only intellectual. 58. There are other people who believe that they have an interest in ending the ego, who do not really have an interest in ending the ego. 59. Almost all of the people on a spiritual path that claims to have as its aim the ending of the ego illusion actually have very little desire to end the ego illusion. 60. The way to end all of the ego's preservation strategies is to increase the desire for liberation. 61. There are few, very condensed direct path teachings that can be a great help on the direct path. 62. You will find those direct path teachings in the 6 books of the self-realization series. 63. However, to go on and on, reading thousands of spiritual or religious books and discussing spiritual teachings is an ego preservation strategy to keep you in the realm of thought instead of practice. 64. All the time you spend reading and discussing could be better spent practicing the awareness, watching awareness method. That is assuming you have dropped all of your unnecessary activities. If you have not dropped all of your unnecessary activities to create the maximum amount of time for the practice of the awareness, watching awareness method, then read all 6 books in the self-realization series cover to cover over and over again until you do drop all of your unnecessary activities to create the maximum amount of time to practice awareness, watching awareness. 65. Practice leads to liberation. 66. Endless reading of the false spiritual or religious teachings from the past and discussing spiritual or religious teachings leads to illusion. 67. The ego creates arguments against the direct path as a preservation strategy. 68. The ego recalls indirect path, direct paths as an ego preservation strategy. 69. Instead of spending all of one's spare time in spiritual practice, the ego finds almost endless ways to spend one's spare time, and this is one of the ego's primary preservation strategies. Some examples are television, entertainment, reading, discussing, and thinking. The ego can find thousands of ways to avoid spiritual practice. 70. If you drop all of your unnecessary activities, you will have much more time for spiritual practice. 71. One ego preservation strategy, one of the imposter's tricks, is creating arguments against what is written here instead of open-mindedly considering the possibility that what is revealed in this book points towards the truth that the ego prevents most people from seeing. 72. Another ego preservation strategy trick the imposter uses is deciding in advance that one of the methods described in the self-realization series of books will not work, without ever giving the method a sincere try. 73. See how the ego directs every thought to create a way to preserve its imaginary self. 74. In other words, ask of every thought, idea, concept, belief, etc. Does this thought, idea, concept, or belief help the ego illusion to continue? 75. When you form a belief, you are no closer to discovering the absolute truth than you were before you formed that belief. 76. When you form a belief, you have created an obstacle to discovering the absolute truth. 77. If you were honest instead of a belief, your view would be, I don't know. 78. If you really want the truth, you would insist on direct experience. 79. If you really wanted truth, you would never accept a belief. A belief is only a group of symbols. All words are symbols. 80. The extremely intense desire for liberation is the key to ending the ego's tricks. Book 2 in the Self-Realization series, The Desire for Liberation, contains step-by-step instructions for awakening the extremely intense desire for liberation. 81. Allow yourself to see how the imposter self has enslaved you by seeing its preservation strategies. 82. Reading all 6 books in the Self-Realization series is a great first step towards conquering all of the obstacles the false self creates. 83. Reading over and over, reflecting on each sentence is very important. If at some point in the future you have dropped all unnecessary activities and are using all of the free time thus created to practice the awareness watching awareness method, then your time will be far better spent in practice instead of reading. However, in the beginning, most people need a foundation to motivate them to drop all unnecessary activities, to create the maximum amount of time to practice, and thus in the beginning, reading these authentic direct path teachings is very important. 84. Your motivation while reading is very important. 85. The correct motivations are: 86. Extremely intense self-honesty. 87. An extremely intense desire to directly experience the infinite, eternal, absolute truth. 88. A willingness to let go of all the ideas you have accumulated in the past. 89. An extremely intense longing to be free of sorrow and to live in eternal joy. 90. If the extremely intense desire for liberation is awakened in you, it will bring everything you need to succeed at bringing the imposter self to its final end, so that you can remain eternally as your true self, which is absolutely perfect, infinite awareness, love, bliss, that has never experienced any sorrow or suffering in all of eternity. 91. Remember the 2 great keys to self-realization. A. Awakening the extremely intense desire for liberation, and B. Self-honesty. Self-honesty begins by actually seeing the ego's preservation strategies. 92. When the extremely intense desire for freedom is awakened, clarity, sincerity, earnestness, insight, and discernment are also awakened. And then you can see what is essential and what is not essential. 93. The end of the ego is the end of all suffering and all sorrow for all eternity. 94. The end of the ego is infinite, eternal awareness, love, bliss. 95. Realize that ending the ego is the only true worthwhile event that can happen in a human life. 96. Take a look at your actions moment by moment to see if they conform to the realization that ending the ego is only truly valuable event that can happen in a human life. 97. The ego projects thoughts and fantasies, and the ego interprets. 98. One way to stop this distortion is to ask, what is the false self doing right now to preserve its imaginary self? 99. Another way to stop the distortion is to ask, have I added a concept or interpretation to what I am reading? 100. Most people project much thinking onto the readings that they read. 101. Their thinking has very little to do with the teachings they have read. 102. Almost all humans are in a state of chaotic confusion. 103. Most people do not realize that they are in a state of chaotic confusion. 104. Interpreting what is written is an expression of that chaotic confusion. 105. Actually practicing 98 and 99 above can help greatly to end that distortion. 106. Almost everyone underestimates how deceptive the false self is. 107. The imposter self can be brought to its final end. 108. What remains is absolutely perfect, eternal love bliss.